Hey, let's have some real talk about death and resurrection in the Old Testament. Don't know when you're watching this. At the time I'm releasing this, it is Holy Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday, when Christians celebrate Jesus' resurrection from the dead. A pretty amazing moment. Seems kind of unlikely, but this is indeed the belief. And in the New Testament, we see a flourishing, vibrant world of heaven, of hell, and some such things. But what about in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible? Why does it seem so silent about this idea of an afterlife? Is it that they all believed there was an afterlife and there was even a heaven and a hell, and they just kind of like didn't want to talk about it? Seems like an important thing to talk about if you believe that that's a true feature of the world. So what's really going on here? There are kind of two theses I would put forward, which I'll sort of talk through here in this video. And then I'll do a review of some major books that have been written about this topic of death and resurrection in the Old Testament. But the two theses I would like to put forward, moderating theses, I'm a moderate man, what can I say, is that for those who have said, oh, no, the Old Testament is just the same as the New Testament. The Bible, it just has a consistent message everywhere about the afterlife. I think that that's maybe overplaying the hand of the text a little bit. I mean, the Old Testament really is different on this topic. And I think a review of some passages and some themes and some terminology might help us to see that. On the other hand, for those who say that the Old Testament is somehow silent about resurrection or silent about an afterlife or something like that, I think that that's clearly wrong too. It might not be a vibrant theme that's being pushed in every single book and every single chapter and so on, right on the surface at least, but it is there. I think it just requires like a little bit of looking and a little bit of diligence. So without further ado, there are different terms for death and for dying that really do appear in the Old Testament. Many of these terms seem like they're terms for like ghosts or something like that. I think of the term of ghost of some kind or something like that, or even a term like knowing ones built on the root yada, the yada'im, yada'nim, I should say, in Isaiah 8:19, for example. Knowing ones seems to be built on the root yada, for example. Corpse, possibly even a reference in Psalm 16 to the dead as the holy ones on the root kadosh or kadash. You also have a term Rephaim, which is used many times, a term of interest, particularly for those interested in giants in the Bible in heroic terms, and this is also a term for the dead, a very complex thing there. One of the phrases that's used a lot, particularly in the book of Genesis, particularly in the Torah, and particularly in the books of Samuel and Kings, when we get these death notices for various kings who die, is this idea of being gathered to your kin, or gathered to your ancestors, or gathered to your fathers. This has been interpreted as a simple euphemism for death, just like, yep, you go where they went, which is you're dead and you're not alive anymore. But it's also been seen as a reference to the dead joining their ancestors in Sheol, a term we'll get to in a second, the place of the dead. So something more like a kind of spiritual ongoing continuity, right? You get a lot of references to proper burial and refusal of burial being a punishment, mentioned in many different places, as well as burning of the dead, a punishment that occurs and is repeated at various points. I mean, the idea of burning and poor burial and so on, maybe prefigures in a way kind of like an idea like hell, the idea that something bad can really happen to you. Burials would perhaps occur on ancestral land. There's this article by Brichto, Kin, Cult, Land, and Afterlife, a Biblical Complex. Maybe I'll put a link to that down below, or you can just search for it, where he really went hard on this idea of death and afterlife and burial being an ancestral thing, something where you come into continuity with your family. And Brichto even suggested, I don't know if he was the first to suggest this, that article came out in the 1970s, but suggested that in the Ten Commandments, the commandment to honor your father and mother, that this might have actually included an implication that children's or descendants take care of their dead ancestors, their family in the land and the burials on that land. Very few texts in the Old Testament speak explicitly about resurrection. I mean, the examples that are cited the most often would be Daniel 12, where you get a very explicit reference at the end of the book to those who will go down in shame and those who will be honored and have some kind of special feature of their ongoing life when they're dead. However, it's a little bit of like an exception that proves the rule in a sense, since many scholars think that the book of Daniel might have been written in the 2nd century BCE, making it one of the last books of the Hebrew Bible in the development, thus confirming the idea that explicit reference to resurrection is something that just came later in the corpus. We also have, of course, though, Isaiah 26, kind of in this range. Isaiah 26:19. I have a Bible right here. Why not just look it up? I said I was going to mention these possible places, subtle though they are, where we could see resurrection, so I should at least mention it if I say that. Isaiah 26:19. Well, I should start a little earlier. O Lord, in distress they sought you, verse 16. They poured out a prayer when your chastening was on them, like a woman with child who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she is near her time. So we were because of you, O Lord. So there's a lament element here. We were with child, we writhed, but we gave birth only to wind. We have won no victories on earth, and no one is born to inhabit the world. Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. It's kind of a cryptic reference, and it's not clear what the connection is that to the lament element. Maybe the lament element is or the resurrection element follows upon the lament element as a kind of compensation for this lament. I'd also mention Hosea chapter 6. Hosea chapter 6 begins, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for it is he who has torn, and he will heal us. He has struck down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live before him." So the idea there of a resurrection on the 3rd day in Hosea is kind of an interesting passage, right? Where you can at least see a suggestion here. Other texts, though, just seem explicitly to deny a resurrection or any life after death. I'm thinking, of course, famously of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where the author there is like, hey, I should read that one too, because it's a pretty poignant passage if you've never heard it read. Where is the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, you might ask? It's a good question, and clearly I can't find it right here. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. Here we go. Moreover, Ecclesiastes 3:16, "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to human beings that God is testing them to show that they are but animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity." Now, if you stopped at this point, you might say, okay, he's not denying that there's a resurrection or a life after death. It's kind of just a point about the futility of life and how it's true that, you kind of die just like your dog, and that's just kind of a sad fate. But he goes on. "All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? So I saw that there's nothing better than that they all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. Who can bring them to see what will be after them?" You could still say he's not denying completely a resurrection. He's just saying that he's heard of the idea, but he doesn't know about it. Again, maybe a book here that occurs later in the corpus of writings, maybe a book from the 300s or the 200s BC. I don't really think we have a clear dating on the book of Ecclesiastes. When ideas of resurrection, maybe from Greek thought, some scholars might say, had permeated the culture there in Israel, Palestine, and now he's saying, yeah, I've heard of this idea, but I don't really know. Okay. I would like to point out, though, that resurrection does actually literally occur in the Hebrew Bible in a couple of instances, like 2 Kings chapter 2, Elisha raises a woman's son to life after he's died. Another individual contacts Elisha's bones in the grave, and he gets resurrected on that basis. There are 2 individuals, famously Enoch and Elijah, who are said not to have died at all. So you at least have some slippage there around the edges that suggests there is room for this life after death, even if it's not a Christianized, elaborate type presentation. I'm not going to mention that. Okay. The so-called intertestamental literature, sometimes called pseudepigraphic literature, it depends if it's pseudepigrapha or not, but from the 3rd, 2nd century BCE or so, is replete with references, though, to the afterlife, suggesting there's a blossoming of the idea. The Catholic doctrine of purgatory is famously based on 2 Maccabees, chapter 12, where a character, the noble Judas, goes along gathering up bodies of those who have fallen in battle so that they can have a better resurrection. He's taking account of the resurrection, right? So this sense that there's some kind of movement even after death, depending on what happens, becomes a scriptural basis for Catholics, for whom the book of 2 Maccabees is actually scripture. First Enoch imagines a legal context for resurrection, kind of like Daniel does, a time of judgment. And of course, the New Testament has a very developed notion of afterlife. Now, on this question of Judaism, though, and this is where one of my former teachers on my dissertation committee, John Levinson at Harvard Divinity School, I didn't go to Harvard Divinity School. I went to Harvard University in the graduate school, but there was a lot of crossover between the Divinity School and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And so I was glad I was able to be with Professor Levinson in some context and have him be a reader on my dissertation. But he has a ton of great books, including a book. I don't want to bungle the title. What's the title of his book? He has a great book on resurrection that you should totally read within Judaism. It's called Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, The Ultimate Victory of the God of Life, 2006, Yale University Press. It's on my bookshelf right behind me. I just didn't get it here. He wants to point out, though, against many kind of more progressive Jews who would say, resurrection, it's not a major theme. Jews don't really believe in that. He wants to say, oh, no, we do believe in that. And he points out how many traditional Jewish prayers and references mention the resurrection, and how, in fact, this is a traditional belief of Judaism, and that, in fact, that there were many Jews, and even references in the Mishnah, for example, which reference it. There's even a reference in an interpretive passage from early Judaism on the book of Exodus, which suggests, all kinds of passages give us reference to the resurrection of the dead. In fact, no passage lacks the resurrection of the dead, but we lack the capacity to interpret properly, reads one Jewish midrash that Levinson quotes in his book. So I think that's a very fascinating thing. Now, on this term Sheol, what does Sheol mean? It's maybe the most common term for the dead and for the place of the dead, really, the land of the dead. In the Hebrew Bible, it occurs nearly 70 times. What does it mean? It doesn't clearly mean something like hell, although in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, I believe that they translated this in most cases, almost in every case, as Hades, making an equivalent to the Greek concept of the afterlife as Hades. And in the Vulgate, you get, infernum, or, the inferno, a place of burning. Not clearly like this, though, just in Hebrew. I mean, people have suggested all kinds of etymologies. Maybe the most common one would be that it's from the verb sha'al, to ask or to inquire. It's one interpreter, Theodore Lewis, who writes about these issues, Johns Hopkins, has said this is the kind of the most obvious etymology and the least strained. How does one take then, though, this asking? Who's asking who what? Is it a place where one is asked about one's deeds in life? Perhaps. That sounds like a very Christianized judgment kind of context. I think maybe Lewis thinks it's the asking is maybe more like these are people of whom it could be thought you could ask you could ask things. You could consult the dead. You could ask them, right? So not so much that the dead are being asked, but that we're asking the dead for knowledge, okay? A practice that's actually forbidden in various places in the Bible, particularly in Deuteronomy. People have suggested all kinds of other, parallels and so on that are maybe less convincing than that one. Sheol is this much is clear about Sheol. It's underneath the earth. It's down below. It's a physical location. It's like the earth's basement, right? It's a place of darkness. It's a place that maybe has gates. It has a ruler. It's personified, in a sense. You go down to it. Going to Sheol may not have a moral value in most cases, not as a punishment. Sheol can simply be a poetic euphemism for death or the grave, right? It's a place where everyone goes. What was Israel's inheritance from from the surrounding nations in terms of death and afterlife? Mesopotamia to the east, very tough to generalize there because you're talking about a lot of different cultures over a very long period of time. Clearly, in some periods, you had some things that looked like developed afterlife theology, particularly in mythology about the gods. There's a myth about a goddess going down into the underworld. There's an underworld journey that famously occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or at least as part of that tradition. So unclear. Burials were just, very commonly done inside houses often. Maybe some objects in the tomb, which could be a kind of emotional attraction to the dead, kind of like remembering them in a way, or could be, in a sense, thought to provide something for the dead. At which time we turn to Egypt, where obviously we have much more developed ideas about the afterlife. Egypt's very famous for this. Not only the burials of kings, of course, with lots of objects and grave goods and so on, and pyramids. Of course, that was not the average kind of burial there. But the kind of general, at least cliche, is to think that from the Mesopotamians, you have this idea that maybe there aren't a lot of elaborate afterlife ideas, but the Egyptians, there are a lot of elaborate ideas. And Israel's kind of, in the Old Testament is somewhere in between these places, right? A quick review of some of the big books that have been written about this topic. This is by no means a comprehensive review, but just a couple. Klaus Sprank, Beatific Afterlife in Ancient Israel and the Ancient Near East, from the year 1986. I guess sort of recent. I'm still thinking 1986 is recent. Okay. If you're an ancient historian, what's a few decades or a few hundred years, okay? One of Sprank's arguments was that maybe Israel avoided elaborate talk about the afterlife because they didn't want to seem too much like the Canaanites, whom they perceived as being into Egyptian-style elaborate ideas. Nevertheless, Sprank did see various passages that could support the idea that ancient Israelites did believe in an afterlife, right? Ted Lewis, whom I mentioned earlier, Johns Hopkins, I think recently retired, 1989, had a book called Cults of the Dead in Ancient Israel and Ugarit. It's a book I've used a lot over the years. I relied on it at various points heavily in my dissertation, I remember. Just part of the school of thought that I guess I came from there. He argued that there was a vibrant, what he called a cult of the dead in ancient Israel. So just like he thought there was at Ugarit, just a little bit further north up the coast, where we have some texts and some archaeology. Maybe it was the case he thought that people would actually feed the dead. At Ugarit, we have some graves, we have some burials where there were even feeding shafts or tubes where people could maybe pour a liquid down or stuff some food down there for the dead, okay. And so maybe there were periods when ancestor worship in ancient Israel was a thing. And then you see the reaction against that, of course, in the biblical corpus, like in Deuteronomy, where they're like, do not do that. Do not communicate with the dead. Okay, don't do any of these kinds of things. If they were against it, it must have been a real live practice, he reasoned. Brian Schmidt, another author, 1994, had a book called Israel's Beneficent Dead. I'll link all these down below as I usually do. I don't know if anybody uses the notes down below or the description, but I use it as a kind of footnotes to document the things I'm talking about. So if you want to follow up, please do. Israel's Beneficent Dead, Ancestor Cult and Necromancy in Ancient Israelite Religion and Tradition. He was a lot more cautious about saying that Israel had cults of the dead. Pretty much he critiques the idea that in ancient Israel and Ugarit, that people thought of the dead offering supernatural, beneficent, beneficiary powers to the living. So he's a little bit more dismissive. He says at one point regarding the biblical text, general prohibitions against mortuary rites in the Hebrew Bible are late and limited only to two: mourning rites of self-mutilation and necromancy. This idea of trying to consult the dead, and so on. I mentioned John Levinson's book, Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel. Just a great book, just lots of great Jewish sources in there. I really enjoyed reading that book. And the victory of the God of life for Levinson, that if I'm remembering the book correctly, that he ultimately wants to highlight, it's kind of like, it's a bracing corrective measure that I think Christians would do well to take also, which is the idea that resurrection from the dead is not, it's not primarily a personal thing, like about your individual fate, like, oh, I hope I pray the right prayer or do the right religion or whatever so I can get saved and not go to hell. But rather, he wants to point out for Judaism, and I think that this works well for Christianity too, resurrection is about God's victory over all that is destroyed and desert-like and chaotic and wrong in the world. And it is primarily that victory. Resurrection is not about my personal victory to do the right religion or the correct prayer. It's about God's victory over death, God's victory over Satan. Lots of different images here and ways you could talk about it. And the idea that being joined with God, then we come up in the train of the Lord's robe, as it were. So if he gets resurrected, if he's flying up there and defeating death, we get to come along with that. We join in that, right? I'm not leading the way with my private soul being resurrected. And that was a point I remember from Levinson's book that I thought was just like really powerful, really powerful. Liz Bloch-Smith, great archaeologist, great scholar. She has a book called, what the heck is her book called? It's from 1992. Judite burial practices and beliefs about the dead. Archaeology, she goes through the various kinds of burial customs that ancient Israelites used. Some of them would lend to a belief that the ancient Israelites were putting grave goods and burial in a certain way that they show through their practice, that we now see through archaeology, a kind of ideological belief in the afterlife or in some ongoing existence at least. I also wanted to mention 2 newer books on this. I've used these books and read parts of them, but I haven't read them both in full like a novel or anything, so it awaits further research. But 2015, Christopher Hayes, called A Covenant with Death. I don't have the book here, but I printed out the cover just so I could show it, just to show some new work. A Covenant with Death, Death in the Iron Age 2 and its Rhetorical Uses in Proto-Isaiah, published with Erdmans. I believe this is a revision of an earlier book that he had published. Great book, and I think one of the key points in this book is to show how, particularly in Isaiah chapters 1 through 39, the prophet there seems to be drawing on a lot of different ideas of death and afterlife, perhaps even in conversation with changes in belief about death and afterlife that had occurred in Egypt during this time period, or even in Mesopotamia, where you had, like in any culture, various ideas becoming more or less popular, and is able to show in some ways, very sophisticated, subtle ways, that maybe the prophet was even aware of these other views and was reacting either against them or with them, and maybe adjusting them in ways that would make his own message more powerful. And we certainly see Isaiah as a very intelligent prophet who was aware of lots of these other ideas, so that wouldn't be surprising if that were true. And then the final book I'll mention, Matthew Suriano, A History of Death in the Hebrew Bible, Oxford University Press, 2018. Just a great book here as well. Emphasizes the idea of going down to the fathers and the family tomb. Does a lot of archaeology, and really wants to speak about the treatment of the dead is not so much like just about the destiny of the soul of the dead or something like that, but rather about the ongoing relationship that the living have with the dead. And I think that there's something really helpful about that approach, because it makes sense of the evidence. It's not as though death is just this kind of chasm and you just bury the dead and you just forget about it. But no, kind of like Brichto's article where he mentions this commitment, maybe even embodied in the commandment to honor your father and mother, that there's a kind of an ongoing commitment which doesn't even end at death and which keeps on going, which involves memory, speaking the name of the dead, maybe even providing, gifts or offerings of some kind, whether they're believed to be just a memorial function or literally efficacious or in some way, I don't know. But clearly this is an area that continues to draw academic interest just because the Old Testament has so many different kinds of concepts and these hints of resurrection that are maybe not as fully blossomed as one might like to think. And so the question is like, why is it like that? Anyway, I hope this is good to think with around this time of Easter, or really any time you want to think about death and resurrection in the Old Testament.